Hello, Miami alumni and friends. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. And today, as part of our annual Winter College webinar series, we present Unlocking Housing Solutions, Accessory Dwelling Units, and how addressing accessory dwelling units, sorry about that, could play a key role. Joining us today are Murali Paranandi, Professor of Architecture, and Jeff Kruth, Assistant Professor of Architecture and Director of Graduate Studies. Welcome to you both, and thank you so much for joining us. This program and Winter College is in its fifth year online, and it includes a week long of special online events featuring Miami faculty, staff, and alumni. So we hope you'll consider joining us for some of our other Eastern Standard Time presentations tomorrow and the Love and Honor Awards tonight at 7:15. Also join us for a virtual wine tasting with Jack Keegan tomorrow evening on Valentine's Day. And please join us for a special toast to Charter Day with a virtual bourbon tasting with Phil Collin and Mike Crowder on Monday, the 17th. Special thanks to our sponsor for Winter College, the Knolls of Oxford. We appreciate the partnership and the Knolls for helping us bring this programming to life. So just a reminder to the live audience, please feel free to submit your questions and comments throughout the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question button under your video. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Murali and Jeff to tell us a little bit about these alternative housing solutions. Welcome.
All right. Thank you, Molly. We appreciate that. We're glad to join you all, even though we can't see you. So we're excited to share with you some of the work that we've been doing over the last year or so, and it's kind of taken a couple different forms. So I think with that, we should be able to just, hop right into the slides, and hopefully you can all see those. So looking at this idea of accessory dwelling units, we'll explain a little bit more kind of the technicalities of them. But really, sometimes you'll hear them as, granny flats or backyard homes. They kind of have a couple different names. The more kind of technical zoning language is accessory dwelling units or ADUs. So that's kind of how we'll refer to them in this presentation. And this presentation comes from a little bit of an article that Murali and I we wrote last year, how building more backyard homes, granny flats, and in-law suites can help alleviate the housing crisis. So trying to think about our background in architecture and how it kind of relates to some of these social and economic and spatial kinds of questions. So these are kind of just a little bit of the outline of the conversation for today. Just we'll give you kind of an overview, a little bit of a history lesson, and then we'll get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty. And then we'll actually kind of end with some of the work that Murali and I are doing in our own studios with the students. And that's always very exciting, is to bring this work to the students as well. So probably, as many of us are aware, right, there's a lot of talk these days about housing and what's kind of influencing the cost of housing. These are just some of these cost influences. We won't go into too much detail about this, right? But we see obviously kind of rising costs, just due to construction itself. Wages, debt, different kinds of funding. Largely what we'll talk about today is this idea of regulations and how sort of working in the kind of regulatory environment can help spur some of these things. And I think, the caveat that Murali and I have coming into this is that ADUs, no single one thing is probably the solution to this, right? This is just kind of one small component that we're kind of choosing to look at that we think would be helpful, and we think it's a good tactic for a variety of reasons, right? So here are just some of these indicators in terms of rising housing costs over the decades, and in particularly in the last couple of years since COVID. We've been seeing, rises both in rent, but also in terms of just housing cost to purchase as well. And this has kind of been an ongoing trend, and again, has kind of been accelerated by things like COVID, things like different financialization kind of mechanisms and policies and all these kinds of things, right? And again, we won't go into too much detail on these things, but certainly this is just all kind of part of the conversation, and certainly maybe in even recent-ish memory, we can think back to things like the housing foreclosure crisis of 2008, 2009, where people really started to kind of think differently. And we're sort of looking at Detroit here. People started to sort of think a little bit differently about housing choices, housing options, and trying to think through it. I think one of the tensions that Murali and I are both kind of interested in is choices that are made out of kind of economic necessity versus ones that are perhaps more built out of intention, right? And so we have these kind of ends of the spectrum, and so people are kind of looking into these alternative forms of weighing, right? And this is more so at the fringes. But if anybody's seen Nomadland, it's a really fantastic film. I think won the Best Picture in 2020. It's a beautiful film, and it's got Frances McDormand, and she sort of is living out of her van, somewhat by choice, somewhat by economic necessity, and again, that kind of tension is really kind of apparent, all the way to things like tiny homes, right? This is a more recent kind of trend. Same thing with van life, right? A lot of our students are interested in this kind of social media friendly form of van life. So people kind of living in these kind of different alternative ways, certainly not ways that we would think of as more mainstream, but this certainly is starting to influence and starting to get us to think a little bit differently about housing, which is frankly probably an overdue conversation. Myself personally, I work a lot in the region, in Cincinnati, and I'll show you a little bit more in Dayton later in the presentation. But even within Hamilton County ourselves, we have an identified shortage of 60,000 affordable housing units, and this report was released by LISC and the Xavier Community Building Institute, came out in 2017, so it's probably much higher than that, but this is the most recent kind of thorough study that we've had looking at housing affordability in the region. So I'll give you a little bit of a history background, and for those of you that like history, hopefully this is interesting. I have to kind of watch myself to make sure I don't go too much into the weeds here, but where we're at is actually really fascinating in terms of kind of the history and legacy of just thinking about how we think about space, how we think about home ownership, and this goes all the way back to shortly after the founding of the country. And I love to show this to students. One of my favorite things in the world is this place called the Point of Beginning, which is where the public land survey system began in 1785, and that's right at East Liverpool, which is basically at the boundary between West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. So this was a grid that was basically kind of spread out. This was really kind of influenced by Thomas Jefferson into these kind of 6 mile by 6 mile townships. The idea being that you could kind of, take a donkey with a cart, and from within sort of a day's span, you could go to one township to the other and back. So this was somewhat kind of the rationale for the 6 mile by 6 mile grid, and sort of spread across, what was at the time kind of the Western Territory beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And this, of course, expanded over time into these ideals around manifest destiny, this kind of idea of westward expansion. And so housing and this idea of kind of having your own domain has really been it's sort of baked into the DNA of American life in some ways. And so, not to get too much into the weeds here, but other sort of local, regional kind of examples are places like New Harmony, Indiana. This was a town that was sort of built to be very self-sufficient, built by a Welsh industrialist. And today, it never quite really took off in the ways it's kind of imagined, but it was this very kind of intentional community. Built in 1814, a little bit near Canton, Ohio. We had Zor, Ohio. A lot of these communities, I mention these because what we think of, or one of the things that we'll kind of get to in terms of thinking about ADUs, is that there used to be much more kind of diversity in terms of sort of families, lifestyles, not just kind of centered around the nuclear family, which is primarily how we still think about housing today. So historically, this has been a much more of kind of a fine gradient of social relationships in the ways that we've all kind of lived together. So these are just some examples, largely from the 1800s. And then, of course, on the sort of the flip side, we have sort of urban crowding really beginning in the 19th century, right? So we think of the tenements in New York City, for example, overcrowding, a lot of kind of multi-generational living, a lot of it obviously born out of economic necessity. And it created a lot of these kind of more or less kind of undesirable kinds of conditions. This is up in Cleveland. This is the Irish town Bend, where a lot you had of these kind of shanty towns. So a lot of these kind of less desirable conditions. And maybe on kind of the other end of the spectrum, we have still tenement housing, but this is in Over the Rhine. If you're familiar with Cincinnati. And we would call these decorated tenements, right? So a little bit kind of nicer. It has some kind of ornamentation in the buildings. This is actually the largest concentration of Italianate architecture in the whole country. And Miami, and in particular, our department and the Center for Community Engagement have worked in this neighborhood for decades at this point. So we had really kind of this range, right? Overcrowding, and this actually kind of bore a lot of some of the first regulations around the built environment in the early 20th century, where we had kind of tenement reform. And some of this was also born out of, we just came out of a pandemic. But, so thinking about, there's a Spanish flu of 1918, there were lots of cholera outbreaks due to all this kind of overcrowding. And so a lot of the reform came from trying to get light and air into the buildings, right? And trying to de-densify the housing, putting indoor plumbing in, accommodating for, in case there was a fire, right? So thinking about fire escapes and all these kinds of things. So we saw this kind of first iteration of regulatory reform in the built environment, or the first sort of systematic regulatory reform born out of kind of the industrial city. And so we also started to see, these other kinds of housing options, right? One of my favorites being the Philadelphia, the Trinity houses, which are literally, there's sort of one room on each floor. They are these kind of quite small, tiny houses, often 15, 16 feet wide, so very small. But what was nice about them is that you had these kind of nice kind of communities sort of facing onto each other. And then these were at the kind of the backsides of what were more major kind of urban streets. So we saw this kind of mixture of housing in cities that was worked really well from a lot of perspectives, from social, economic kinds of perspectives. Again, Ohio is sort of at the forefront of a lot of some of these actually kind of national conversations. Zoning itself was born out of the Euclid v. Ambler Supreme Court case that came forward in 1926. And there was a lot of this tension between industrial land uses basically being right up against like residential land uses, right? And there's lots of reasons why. This is before we have regulations on smoke and all these things around the factory. So there was, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of zoning, which kind of created the separation of uses in the interest of public welfare. And there's kind of a two-sided story to this a little bit, in the sense that on one hand, it's great from a kind of public health perspective, public welfare perspective, to get these uses away from each other. But also it sort of lends itself to a lot of the thinking at the time, which was to lean us towards single family housing as the predominant kind of model for housing. And I'll kind of explain that in just a second. So what was kind of happening at the time, these are also in response to kind of the industrial city. If anybody's familiar with Marymount, Ohio, just outside, or just on the east side of Cincinnati, Forest Hills Gardens. These were these garden suburbs that were sort of thought of as this ideal between city and country life, right? So kind of a hybrid of best of both worlds is kind of how it was thought of. And still, Marymount today is a highly desirable place to live. A lot of kind of good mixture of housing, different kinds of densities and housing types. Certainly people like Frank Lloyd Wright were also sort of thinking about these ideas of getting out of the industrial city. So this is his famous Broadacre City example from 1932. And you can see some of the sort of fantastical design elements in them. These are, sort of helicopter-like things, or maybe drones even today, we might think of them, that were, of course, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright himself. Never really came to fruition. But so you had a lot of this kind of dialogue around kind of the fear of different kinds of population mixing and overcrowding. And so there was this famous phrase that was kind of thrown around at the time, this idea of the larger evil, right? So at the time, in the early 1920s or so, early part of the 20th century, you had a lot of people boarding, right? You might share your house with people who were coming to the city to work, doing all these kinds of things, living again multi-generationally, etc. And a lot of a lot of the early zoning reforms really tried to segregate these uses, both economically, socially, racially, etc. And what it really sort of started to do was to create kind of a homogenization, or it led to kind of the next generation of homogenous kind of housing types, most famously in the post-war period with places like Levittown in New York. And these happened, there were a couple of these all over the place, but these are largely what we think of when we think of subdivision development. And really kind of the genius of Levitt was he was applying basically industrial methods to housing production, which allowed him to very quickly kind of produce, today we might think of these as kind of cookie cutter, but it rapidly kind of produced these relatively inexpensive housing units at a time when wages were also rising. And so this is how we get a lot of suburbanization and sprawl, right? So we still largely kind of continue to build in this way on these kind of single family lots, and to the point where today about 75% of the residential land use in the US is zoned for single family. And so I think the argument Murali and I are trying to put out there is this idea of kind of, not to necessarily entirely get rid of single family zoning, because it's a lot of what we have and it's still desirable for a large amount of people, but to really try and think to get back to kind of a little bit of this idea of the hybrid, or how can we kind of mix in other kinds of densities, other kinds of uses that might also be desirable from a social perspective, from an economic perspective, et cetera, right? And we can sort of see here just the growth of the size of the house, and sort of inversely we have the sort of shrinking of the size of families and the amount of people living in houses. So and you can sort of see here, right, the ranges of the densities of how many dwelling units are on each acre. And you'll sometimes hear this term called the missing middle. And so right on one end, we have things like detached single family homes, and then we can think of more dense cities, New York, et cetera, where we have quite a bit of density, mostly kind of multifamily types of apartments, et cetera. And so there's this argument, or this growing movement towards this idea of creating a kind of a missing middle kind of housing. And this means both economically, but also in terms of the building type itself. I want to respond here a little bit to this idea of, in some of the comments we received before the presentation, ADUs and, so what are some of the zoning regulations today that are either sort of greasing the wheels, or maybe inhibiting the things that are these kind of ADU uses, or these alternative kinds of uses. And just to kind of give a local example, Oxford does allow for accessory dwelling units, right? So these are these backyard homes. I won't get into all the language here, but it does allow for them what we would consider by right. So basically, you have the right to construct this as long as it meets these kinds of criteria. In a lot of places, you might be able to build an accessory dwelling unit, but it might come under this purview of what we would call a conditional use, right? So you don't have the outright ability to build it, but through kind of a process through the local planning commission, et cetera, you can still build them. So there's a little bit of a kind of a nuance of how the zoning language is written, and I know Murali will get into that more in his section as well. And of course, right, this is also happening very much in Cincinnati. Most recently, has adopted an accessory dwelling unit policy. And then there was another question in the early questions we received beforehand about, how does this work in terms of taxes? So Cincinnati has chosen to use the accessory dwelling units policy to as included as part of a tax abatement program. So the idea is that if you build an accessory dwelling unit, you don't have to pay taxes on that additional structure. And the idea is that helps sort of incentivize people to build these in order to kind of densify the city and kind of move beyond sort of solely focusing on single family housing. So with that, I'll turn it over to Murali.
Thank you, Jeff. That's a wonderful historical context you provided and how you framed the current situation. I'm Murali Paranandi. I want to take over from here and get into ADUs. So ADU as a word may be relatively recent, but as a concept, it's been there for a while. As we can see, from our paper and some of the intro Jeff provided. So as defined by Freddie Mac, ADU is essentially it's an additional living area that includes a kitchen, bathroom, a separate entrance, and it's independent of the primary dwelling unit, and it is secondary to the primary unit in terms of its value, property value. So there are different types of accessory dwelling units. We cannot get into all of them, but these are the more popular ones. You may not be able to read the text clearly, but there is a detached ADU, so that is separate from the house. And there is a basement conversion, so it could also be part of the basement. And then there's a duplex, and then there is an attached ADU, and there could be a garage conversion, and there is something called a junior ADU. The junior ADU is something that's smaller in size. It cannot be more than 500 square feet, and it could share some facilities like bathrooms, and it could also share a kitchen. So it has some lenience in how it is treated. So in the next slide, you see there can be other types of ADUs. These are more appropriate for higher density urban areas. The next slide. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So why do we want to have ADUs? First of all, ADUs can help alleviate the housing shortage which we are facing, particularly in areas of high housing costs. And they also provide an affordable option, both as rentals and also to own. And they can also help increase the density of existing neighborhoods, which also provides flexibility to have your relatives nearby, your grandparents, or other family members, and you can also use it as a rental property. You could use it as a home office, guest suite. These are just some of the options. ADUs also provide another option for aging in place for seniors. So it's a very attractive option for many of the seniors. And ADUs have a potential to increase the value of the property. And it's also a sustainable thing to do because you're plugging into the existing land use, and you can also update your energy efficiency with modern appliances and things like that. And you're also plugging into the existing infrastructure of sewers and water lines and things like that. So there's no need to have additional ones. So there are also some concerns about ADUs. Most of them relate to the cost. Building an ADU could be expensive depending on its size. And also, it's difficult to find financing options. It's not as straightforward as building a house. There are also complexities involved in zoning and compliance with regulations. And in some areas, there is need for additional parking, so that could be a deterrent. And there are also privacy concerns, having another unit within your property. And there's also this movement of not in my backyard kind of concerns from people about how this changes their neighborhood character. And there is also some concerns about the impact on the existing sewer lines and water usage and so on and so forth. So with this said, let's look at a couple of case studies. So we picked two sort of polar opposite states. So let me start with California. California, as many of us know, has high housing pricing. Also, affordability is a big issue there. So they have done a lot of work in making the housing, addressing the affordable housing as well as homelessness. And over the last 10 years, they've done a lot of legislation action. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So these are, sorry for the heavy text here, but let's just look at the highlights here. As part of their legislation actions, they passed over 100 laws reforming the housing and zoning and permitting processes. And also there was a policy focus on standardizing a framework for ADUs. Essentially, what it did is that the state pretty much set the standards, and the local barriers were removed, so you don't necessarily need to get permits for each of your building codes, such as plumbing or electricity or foundation, etc., as long as you meet a state code that's already approved. And then there is a small scale multifamily housing that was, so the zoning was liberalized, so you could build, they increased the allowance from a single family to multifamily in many areas. And the last one is, this has actually worked. That's why they are getting a lot of attention. So these reforms have resulted in significant increase of ADUs. A Brookings study shows that between the year 2018 to 2013, there is a significant change in the number of ADUs that were built. So about 45,000 ADUs were built. Next slide, please. So these are some of the issues the California law helped address. So one of the biggest hurdles is the HOA covenants. So California law pretty much forbids the HOA to have any unreasonable restrictions. So it could be essentially aesthetic, but nothing more than that. It cannot present undue burden. And in most cases, additional parking is not required, especially if it is on a transit line. And California law also allowed sale of standalone ADUs separately, so that created an incentive. And they also enacted an amnesty program for the ADUs that were built prior to 2020, so the owners could legalize the unpermitted units by bringing it up to code, as well as they also allowed for non-owner occupancy ADUs, so which made it possible for investors to come and build ADUs for rental housing. So these are the major things that these laws addressed. Next slide, please. So Harvard Kennedy School study, this is one of the studies. There are many studies that show that the effect of this legislation. So the upzoning, according to their study, had a clear causal effect on the housing supply. So this liberalizing single family into multifamily units has increased the number of housing units that are available. ADUs, according to this study, did not impose any nuisance effect on the neighbors. So the policymakers should take note of California's success at the state level. Essentially what they did is it was a top-down approach, and that helped with the local regulations and it increased the supply. So zoning is only part of the issue here, and also affordability is a big issue. As we mentioned before, financing is an issue. So there are, the primary form of financing is through home equity loan, but the banks are now considering increased property value because of the addition of the ADU. And California also has a special program. They give a $40,000 ADU construction credit. It's a grant, so you can essentially apply for it, and it's subsidizing your pre-construction costs. Next slide, please. And this is a novel program that they started. So there are pre-approved ADUs that are already permitted. So you can go choose one of these, and then you don't, there's no delay or additional costs involved in getting the permit process. Molly, if you would go to that website, if that's possible. Yeah, so you can just scroll through. So there are pre-approved ADUs. These are designed by renowned architects. They invited many architects to come in and provide solutions for ADUs, and these are considered to be very prestigious and high design solutions that have been vetted through the permitting process, and they are ready to go. So some of these are free. Some of them you have to pay the architect design fee. But once it's done, you don't have to go through any permit process. You just can go ahead and get it built. And there are a number of builders that work with these plans, and there are also some prefabrication options. So some of these are made to be made in a factory, and they can just come to your house and install it in as short a time as 2 to 3 weeks. And a number of cases, the manufacturers of these prefabricated units provide financing, making it easier. It's almost like just buying a car now, as opposed to getting a house loan. Yeah, we can go back to the slideshow now, Molly. Thank you. Yeah, so there are hundreds of options, and this is another option. This is so you can also buy kits for converting existing spaces. This is a generic garage conversion kit, and so on. So there are multiple options that are enabled by this California legislation and grant programs and incentives. If you can go to the next one, please. So now let's examine another state, Montana, which is very different. It's a western state, not as populated, big sky country, predominantly Republican red state. However, they have enacted progressive housing legislation. Essentially, they built on top of what California has done, and they are gaining a lot of attention. So very different urban fabric here. So people really care about their environment, and growth and building is viewed as a skeptical thing among the local residents. However, they have gone through a lot of population increase and a crisis in affordable housing with the increase of the housing costs. You can go to the next one, please. So this is the governor, a Republican governor who came into office 2021. He made it his mission to make affordable housing. This is a direct quote from him. He said, "Our population over last 10 years has grown by 10%. The number of the new doorknobs has only gone up by 7%. So basically, he's identifying the supply problem, right? So if you go to the next slide. So this is a graph that shows the increase in the housing prices relative to the years. So Montana, especially after COVID, number of people moved there for the weather and remote work. And so that caused increased demand, as well as there was no additional supply because of the restrictions on where they could build. So that caused a spike in the cost of housing. So in fact, if you go to the next slide. So since pandemic, they've seen 50% increase in the housing prices. The increase in the cost of housing from 1996 to current time in Montana is same as it is in California. So the property values have appreciated, so not the incomes for the local people. So the affordability gap is even higher here. Therefore, based on California laws, they took a top-down approach. Some of the things that they started right off the gate is they reduced the local barriers, and they made the owner occupancy exemption and exemption from additional parking. Next slide, please. And they also promoted the idea that since people care about their environment, they said this is a better alternative. So that was also part of the pitch. And also, there is an income gap. Montana has ski resorts and very expensive houses, and there's the shortage of the affordable housing for workforce is drastic. So this was proposed as one of the viable alternatives. At the same time, they gave local governments a lot of authority in enacting these reforms. So overall, it's really working. So this is working in Montana. So Montana reforms offer a potential blueprint for other red states, other western states, to increase their housing supply. And just to give you an idea of how it is different in Montana, whereas in California, the local municipalities cannot object to a plan that's already approved. So the state restricts their ability to deny your permits. Whereas in Montana, it still is possible for local governments to enact their own legislation. So these are some examples of the variations. For example, in Big Sky, ADUs could be for purely for vacation rental, whereas it may not be the case in Bozeman. So there is some kind of local ownership of legislation there. Yeah. So with that, Jeff, we can go back to you. Jeff, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think where we wanted to kind of end maybe was to spend a few minutes thinking about or talking through. Murali and I are both respectively teaching an upper level studio with third and fourth year architecture students, and looking at these issues of affordable housing in different contexts. So I'm working kind of locally and regionally. I'm working through our Miami University Center for Community Engagement, which I mentioned over the Rhine. A bit earlier, the neighborhood over the Rhine in just to the north of downtown in Cincinnati. So we've been there for 20 plus years. I encourage you to check us out, check out our work. It's been really amazing stuff for quite some time. Check us out, support us, see what we've got going on. So I'll put my little plug out there for that. And so we're working through the Community Center for Community Engagement, and I put together this studio looking at, I basically have two kind of community partners, one in Cincinnati and one in Dayton. So we're kind of looking comparatively between these two cities, and have quite different kinds of housing needs. But so I'm working with the students right now. Actually, they're amazing in the sense that they've taken this stuff up, and they're very enthusiastic about it. And so right now what we're doing is we're kind of doing kind of a mapping analysis. I'm teaching them some GIS skills, and so they're looking at these different census tracts, and they're looking at them for where are their concentrations of poverty, where are their concentrations of where rent might be too high, what we would call housing cost burdened, people spending more than 30% of their income on housing, whether that's rental or home ownership. And then we're also starting to identify some of the amenities, right? So some of the things that are perhaps close by, right, like schools, parks, medical facilities, these things that might actually help to sort of sustain a neighborhood. So we're working with, well, I'll get to that in just a second here, but this comes a little bit from some work with a former colleague that I used to work with the Yale Urban Design Workshop, and they've put together this studio that's actually sort of, they're looking statewide, but they're actually kind of getting these projects built off the ground. And one of the things they're doing is they're working actually with the law school, they're working with people in the business school, and then they're working with the School of Architecture to basically figure out sort of the financing mechanisms and like what are the gaps between the housing, the zoning policy, sort of the housing financial needs. Murali kind of mentioned, right, that these aren't necessarily typical mortgages, and even insurance can be hard to come by because these are a little bit atypical. So doing things like lot consolidations, but other kinds of tools as well. And then these are actually getting built right now, which is pretty impressive, while still kind of fitting into the neighborhood character, right? So they're kind of densifying units, they're providing more affordability. And then the idea is that this will kind of scale up and be applicable at the state level. So sort of taking a lot of those ideas and starting to work with two housing developers, Habitat for Humanity, who I'm sure many of us are familiar with, of Greater Cincinnati, and then East End Neighborhood Development Corporation up in Dayton. And these are both, they've been fantastic partners. I've been working with them for a couple months now, just kind of getting some of the prep work ready. And so we're working with Habitat to kind of identify some sites. They've actually started to build at a little bit more of a dense, 30 units or so. They're actually building 30 units of housing here in Oxford. So we're helping to identify, using those GIS methods, what might be additional sites for them. And then we'll work with the students to kind of develop some preliminary options for how to set those units on a site. And then we're also working with, as I mentioned, East End Community Services up in Dayton. And we're partnering with Unibuilt Homes, which is a modular home company up in Dayton. So they're really kind of fantastic because these companies don't exist everywhere. So we're glad to have kind of a local partner. And the idea is that we will get these things, the students will put together kind of drawing sets that would be, that we could go to the building department to and get some permits. So this is great for the students. It's great kind of professional practice, while also trying to think about some of these larger questions about affordability. Here's kind of some of the context we're working in up in Dayton. This is the Twin Towers neighborhood where East End is located. And, it's one of these kind of classic problems of, the neighborhood itself actually has like a fantastic kind of built fabric, a lot of really beautiful historic kind of architecture, but it's kind of suffered through decades of decline, deindustrialization, population loss, et cetera. So there's a lot of vacancy, and yet it's still a very diverse and vibrant kind of community. And so this is kind of the context we're working, and then we're exploring several of these options actually. So they're looking both at some of the policy implications of, what does it mean to kind of do lot consolidations? How, open is the city to doing things a little bit outside the box? And then even from kind of the construction methods, students are going to be researching. This is also up in Detroit. These are these Quonset huts that have been built and have been largely kind of successful as a model. And you can sort of see there's kind of multiple units all together. And the cost of the construction is quite low, obviously, because your roof and the walls are sort of the same structure. So there's kind of a utility and a cost savings to that. Aesthetically, it may not be everyone's cup of tea, but students are certainly kind of looking into a variety of options. This is another one that we're kind of looking at, and so our community partner has kind of given us this challenge of trying to produce something at $150,000 kind of mark, right? So we're kind of trying to think about housing at that sort of lower end of the scale, because that's what our community partner can produce, and have it be kind of marketable without necessarily having to apply for additional outside funding, grants, et cetera. So I think with that, that's Murali then. And you're on mute, Murali.
Thank you, Jeff. Molly, if you would, open that link if that's possible for you.
I don't think I can open
I
that
just put
link.
the link.
Okay, I
put
see
that
it.
in.
I shall do that right this
Perfect.
second.
All right, so let me get started. So I'm also teaching a studio with third, fourth year students, and we are looking at a different context. We are looking at a global problem with the increase of the population and the need for increased housing and affordability, and the strain on the resources. We are taking an approach of, systems approach that addresses the bigger problem. So we're taking on a bigger site here. So we're taking on Los Angeles. So Los Angeles metro system has a transit-oriented development with the goal of creating affordable housing. So Skidmore, Owings Merrill in Los Angeles office, we have some alumni there. We are working with them, and they've done a feasibility study, and they're actually helping our students and me, guiding us in understanding and tackling this issue. So we are really understanding a bigger situation of what the problem is at a bigger scale. But in order to solve the problem at a bigger scale, we have to come up with a system solution. So we are looking at modular, prefabricated, factory-based design solutions so that these could actually solve this problem at scale. So the students are starting to learn some of these techniques, and they will be addressing various densities and adding, up to 300 to 500 units on each site. So they will choose the site that they want. And they're also learning how to apply this more sustainable mass timber, CLT, which is cross laminated timber based panelization, factory-based technology. I know I'm using a lot of jargon words. I'm so sorry about that. So we're all learning this, such that the cost of construction could happen at a lower cost, at a faster pace, and we can take care of this with the urgency that it needs. So that's what we are looking at. We could go back to the slides, Molly. Thank you.
And I think that's all we have. So we wanted to just, of course, put our contact up there, and to thank you all for joining us. And I think Molly, we'll head to kind of the comments or the section, or the questions, and we can try to answer some of those.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions that came in. Let's see. Um, Elizabeth, she's asking, are these sort of rental, are they considered tiny homes? For example, these ones in California, are these qualifiable as tiny homes? Or I know
Uh,
that's sort of like the trendy name for them. Do they all
no,
qualify?
I'm not sure, Elizabeth, what you mean by tiny homes. Tiny homes are not necessarily ADUs, but a tiny home could be an ADU if it is used for that purpose, right? So
Excellent.
tiny home is an idea of, it's a lifestyle. It's like a minimalist lifestyle. So you could have a tiny home in the middle of a forest as a cabin, versus ADU is a very specific situation. So they're not necessarily designed to be tiny homes, but they could be.
Okay. Let's see. I have another question. This is really more about sort of the standard occupancy. These aren't necessarily for families, correct? These are for perhaps single folks or maybe newly established folks, you know.
I can try to answer that. So I think one of the things we find compelling about them is that they can be quite adaptable and quite flexible in terms of what they can kind of accommodate. And this maybe plays a little bit off of the last question too. So typically, I mean, if we look at the zoning code, right? So typically an ADU is going to be smaller than the primary unit. So let's just say we have a 2,000 square foot house that's at the front of the lot, and then an ADU can be a tiny home, right? So it could be, 500 square feet, and some of those ADUs Murali was showing from Los Angeles, some of them are that small, which are, primarily intended for, one, possibly two people, right? They're basically kind of studio apartment sized. But some of them actually, from that list that Murali was scrolling through, go up to about 1,200 square feet or so, and so those could accommodate a family. I personally live in a 1,300 square foot home. It's got 3 bedrooms. It's efficiently designed, so it's the kind of the range is quite flexible. So we find that as a compelling thing. And then Molly, to kind of your point as well, right? So one of the things that actually personally where I got kind of interested in this idea was thinking about these kind of generational shifts, right? So thinking about there's a really good possible reciprocity between we're thinking about my in-laws potentially moving into an ADU, right? And and this was traditionally where how a lot of these were used. And sort of the trade-off is, things like childcare can be accommodated for in that kind of scenario. You still have the privacy, but then also, as parents get older, there's also that kind of reciprocal care between the generations.
Absolutely. And I know for a lot of middle-aged folks, their, college age children, post-college age children also move back, reside with them. So, there's
Exactly.
certainly lots of opportunities to home your family at home without
Right.
necessarily, all being in the same space,
Right.
which I think could be preferable for a lot of adult children and parents, for
Right.
sure.
Exactly. Right. Right.
Molly, to that point, the website that you scroll through, again, that's just for Los Angeles
Hmm.
County, but number of other local municipalities have pre-approved plans in California. But for the nation, even there's no nationwide standard for ADU building code, but they're working towards it. So there are a lot of pre-made and pre-manufactured factory-based construction companies that you could go to and customize these things. But just that particular thing that you showed us, you can go there and explore various options. So one of the ways to filter through is I'm looking for a 3 bedroom ADU versus I'm looking for 1 bedroom ADU. I'm looking for an ADU that's going to be a studio space. I'm looking for an ADU that's going to be an office space. So you can choose based on different needs that you have. And it's not made for just single person or starter house. It could be for a regular family for sure. And it has a benefit in that seniors may want to have a family on their premises, so that could be a good companionship, and
Absolutely.
there's a lot of benefit, social benefit there as well.
I would agree. And while we've moved away from that, I think there's this sort of natural inclination to maybe move back toward it as, there's a lot of sandwich generationing going on for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question. We have some other questions coming in, but I have another question sort of in a similar down the similar route. Do you see these kind of modular homes, like this brand of modular home, replacing, for example, like a mobile home community? I don't know which is, it seems to me an ADU might be altogether more efficient than a mobile home, for example, but is there some opportunity to maybe meld the two concepts?
It's a loaded question. So, so mobile home, as I understand, it's zoned to be in a certain place, and the code for that type of house is different. And social stigma for a mobile home is there is a stigma about it being substandard, right? So ADU doesn't need to be, and factory-based construction, the prefabrication could be pretty high end. It doesn't need to be a low end, or it could be in any kind of zoned area. Mobile homes can only be in a certain area that are zoned and permitted for that. Is that true, Joe?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, obviously, right that the mobile home parks tend to be sort of a certain economic model as much as anything else, right? As opposed to ADUs are more often sort of thought of within the sort of the single family, single parcel kind of model. But I think yes, absolutely, right. There are really good kind of both design and economic kinds of questions. Thinking about actually, I had a student I was working with last semester who was trying to think about alternatives to mobile home parks and sort of advancing those because it does fit a certain need, right? And it does provide for sort of independent living if you don't want to live in, say, an apartment building. There can be certain kind of advantages to them. Largely, and I draw from Matthew Desmond at Harvard sociologist. If anybody's ever read the book Evicted, he does a really good breakdown of actually some of the more exploitive models of mobile home parks. But so it fills a certain need, but it could also be kind of, I think, reinvented as a potential model. So thinking at the scale of more sort of factory-based construction, so at the lower end of the construction cost, but also how do you sort of fit these needs? I think it's within the same kind of conversation, I think, is maybe what you're
Yeah, I
saying
think
as well.
that's why I asked, because it seems like ADUs have this flexibility to them that could sort of translate to a similar concept, and then thereby sort of maybe even removing that stigma that Murali mentioned, sort of around the traditional mobile home park. Okay, we got a couple other questions. I think we can get a few in before we are out of time officially. Let's see. Beverly asks, what sort of, if we were just scratching the surface, we had some interest in putting an ADU on our property, what's sort of like the first step or two to making that happen?
It really depends on which state and which municipality you're in. It's a lot easier if you're in California. You
I
can
was
apply.
going to say, but it's pretty easy if you're in
Yeah, you can
California.
apply and get a $40,000 grant to start with.
Right.
Yeah, I would say check your local zoning codes, and if you're not, if you have a hard time kind of sifting through that language because it can be quite dense, to contact somebody in the city department to sort of see what is allowable versus what is not. It is becoming more of a trend for cities to adopt these. I think the sort of the wave is kind of coming. There can be pushback, right, in terms of some people not wanting it in their municipality, or what often is kind of the approach is to focus these on in certain zoning districts, right? So you might have different kinds of residential zoning, and so it may be permissible in one area but not another, and that kind of helps split the difference, or it might make sense in some areas as opposed to other areas of your municipality. So checking the zoning codes and or talking to a city official would be a great first step. And then talking to a builder or an architect and sort of starting to think about they can do sort of your site drawings for you, your building drawings. and getting some costs, right? That's usually another thing that people are concerned about, sort of first and foremost. And there's a number of things that you would obviously want to think about, utility hookups and those kinds of things as well.
Lots of extraneous variables, it sounds like.
One couple more things I want to add to that is it also depends on depending on the municipality. For example, where I live, when I checked to add an ADU in my property, there were restrictions. I could add an ADU provided both units are owner occupied. So I looked at it. So as long as someone who is related to me is living in my ADU, I'm permitted to have an ADU on my property. If I'm renting it out, I'm not allowed to do that in my city. So it depends. Say if I move to the next town within Cincinnati, it's different.
Different, right? Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing is the permitting, and that could be an arduous process. Finding a builder who has done this before. Many of these people are, they're driven by a social mission too. So kind of finding someone who's has done this kind of work before, and that would be good. And there are some national players, pre-modular, pre-manufactured ADU type of things. They may offer some experience with that as well.
Yeah, I know that sometimes those permitting and zoning processes can be cumbersome. We actually put a fancy shed with a porch in our backyard, and there was a lot of rigmarole to get that done. So it's not without its, sort of legwork, I would assume.
Yeah, that's the brilliance of California. They saw that as a deterrent. That's the primary deterrent because it's so difficult. So we just to navigate this whole thing. And also financing is a big deterrent. Where do you start? You can't go to a bank.
Right.
So they advise you to take your home equity line of credit. That's the only way to do it. So many places we don't have those options that some of the states have.
Yeah.
So it depends on which state you're in.
And sometimes it's just not even feasible to take your home equity line of credit to,
Absolutely.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that could be barriers here.
And even there, the home equity line of credit, California law requires the banks to look at the added value as the value of the equity rather than your current value. So
absolutely. Let's see. I do have a couple questions asking if you would be willing to either share your slides or contact information with our viewers. It seems to be people are interested in the idea of ADUs. So if you don't mind, I would be happy to share with those who are interested.
Absolutely, no problem.
Sure, absolutely.
Fantastic. All right. Diana says, remind viewers to check their homeowner's insurance carrier to make sure that there are no coverage exclusions. That's something that sort of would be like the next step beyond, oh yeah, I want an ADU, but that could make or break the entire scenario.
That's something that Montana and California both at the state level that require the insurance people to cover it.
So many layers, much like owning a conventional home. Like it's got its own stuff.
Learning curve, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we have gotten to mostly the end of our questions. Unless you have anything to add, I think we can wrap up. And I will, for those viewers who are interested, I am happy to send along contact info. And if you have other questions, you can certainly reach out to the pros here.
Well, it is a pleasure, even though we don't see you. We're happy that you're interested in this, and very nice to meet you.
Well, we are so happy to have had you join us. Thank you for sharing this. I think this will become an ever more popular sort of piece of the conversation as we think about who's living where and how we're living together and all of that good stuff. So this is very forward thinking, and I do appreciate you being here to share it with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for having us and joining us.
Of course. Thanks to all the viewers for watching. Again, a special thanks to Jeff and Murali for being here. In case you had to dip out or leave early or came late, you can watch a recording of this on our website at alumlc/MiamiOH. You can also see all of our other archived webinars. So thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon, and love and honor.
Yeah.